Section 1. The Beginning. Two guys, construction paper, and a fist fight between Jesus and Frosty. Get comfortable. Settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Tonight, we are going all the way back. All the way to the very beginning of one of the strangest, most enduring, most genuinely surprising things that has ever happened in the history of American television. A story that started in a cramped film classroom in Colorado, with two college students who had no money, no plan, and an almost pathological need to make each other laugh. This is the entire story of South Park. Not just the show, not just the episodes or the controversies or the cultural moments. The whole thing. Where it came from, how it was made, what it became, and why, after nearly 30 years, it is still somehow here, still somehow relevant, still somehow managing to surprise people who thought they'd seen everything it had to offer. We're going to move through this slowly and thoroughly. There's no rush tonight. So let's go back to Boulder, Colorado. The year is 1992. The University of Colorado sits at the base of the Flatiron Mountains, and in the film department, there is a class that requires students to collaborate on projects with people they've never met. The class pairs them randomly, forces them together, and hopes for something interesting. Randolph Severn Parker, everyone calls him Trey, is a music and film double major from Conifer, a small mountain town about 30 miles southwest of Denver. He is 22 years old, already a little obsessed with Japanese culture, already deeply in love with Monty Python, and already the kind of person who has trouble doing anything the expected way. His first short film as a student was called Giant Beavers of Southern Sri Lanka, which was essentially a Godzilla parody featuring a student in a beaver costume destroying a scale model of a town. His professor nearly threw him out of class. Matthew Richard Stone is from Littleton, Colorado, a suburb just south of Denver that sits in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. He is studying mathematics and film simultaneously because he is the kind of person who can hold both things in his head at once without them interfering with each other. He is sharp, precise, a little more serious than Parker on the surface, though that surface hides the same fundamental delight in the absurd. They meet in this film class. They discover almost immediately that they share the same bedrock influences. Monty Python's precise, surreal absurdism, the anarchic energy of early Saturday Night Live, the willingness to follow a joke all the way to its most uncomfortable conclusion, rather than stopping politely before it gets too strange. They discover they both do voices. They discover they can make each other laugh harder than almost anyone else can. And they discover that they share a very specific kind of humor, one that treats the most inappropriate subjects with the most cheerful matter-of-factness, as though there is nothing in the world that cannot be made funny if you approach it from exactly the right angle. Parker had already been working on something in the cutout paper animation style, a technique inspired by Terry Gilliam's work in the Monty Python films, where flat images are cut out of paper or card and moved against a background frame by frame to create the illusion of movement. It is painstaking, slow, and produces animation that looks deliberately crude and handmade. Parker had used this technique on an earlier student short called American History, which had actually won a Student Academy Award. He understood the power of the style, the way the crude aesthetic creates a particular kind of comic distance that lets you get away with things a more polished visual style would never allow. In December of 1992, the student film department holds its end-of-semester screening right before the Christmas holiday. Parker and Stone decide to make something for it. They gather construction paper, actual construction paper, the kind you use in elementary school, along with scissors, glue, and an old 8mm film camera. They work quickly, cutting out flat figures, giving them oversized round heads and tiny stick bodies. They create 4 children, one who will eventually become Stan, one who will become Kyle, one who will become Kenny, and one who resembles a fat boy they name Kenny. The character who will eventually become Cartman steals his name in the first iteration. But before we get to that short, it is worth dwelling a little longer on who these two people actually were, because the show they eventually made carries the fingerprints of their specific backgrounds in ways that are worth understanding. Trey Parker was born in Conifer, Colorado in October of 1969. Conifer is a small, unincorporated community in the foothills west of Denver, the kind of place where the mountains are visible from every direction and the nearest major city is an hour's drive away. His father, Randy, Yes, that Randy, the name was borrowed, was a geologist, and his mother Sharon worked in insurance. Parker grew up in a household where both parents worked, in a community that was small and white and relatively isolated, and possessed of the specific kind of conservative civic culture that characterizes small mountain towns in the American West. He was, by most accounts, a disruptive and creative student. He wrote a school play about a trip to the dentist that culminated in elaborate fake blood and traumatized the elementary school children who were supposed to be the audience. He was interested in film from a young age, interested in music, interested in Japanese culture in a way that would later manifest in several South Park episodes, and in his college double major of film and Japanese. He attended a semester at the Berklee College of Music before transferring to Boulder, which tells you something about the breadth of his interest, not just making funny things, but understanding how music worked, how narrative worked, how different disciplines intersected. Matt Stone was born in Houston, Texas, in May of 1971, but grew up in Littleton, Colorado, one of Denver's southern suburbs, and the community that would later become internationally known as the site of the Columbine High School shooting. Stone is 2 years younger than Parker, which means they overlapped at the University of Colorado only because of the specific timing of their enrollment. He was a mathematics major who was also studying film, which speaks to a particular kind of mind. One that is comfortable with systems and logic and the satisfaction of getting things to fit together precisely, while also drawn to the chaos and unpredictability of the creative process. Stone is, by reputation and by the evidence of interviews over the years, the more analytical and businesslike of the two. He has the organizational mind. He is the one who manages the coordination of the production, who handles the relationships with networks and studios and lawyers with more patience than Parker, who tends to operate in a state of concentrated creative panic that is intensely productive but not ideally suited to the diplomatic work of maintaining institutional relationships. Together, they form a creative partnership that has some of the characteristics of the best such partnerships in entertainment history. Complementary rather than identical, each filling gaps in the other's abilities, each preventing the other from going too far in one direction without the counterbalance of the other's perspective. Parker is the primary writer and director. Stone is the primary business operator and the voice that keeps the enterprise functioning. They are, by all accounts, genuinely friends, a friendship that has survived 30 years of the most intense creative collaboration imaginable, which is not nothing. The short they make is called Jesus vs. Frosty. In it, the four children accidentally bring a murderous snowman to life. The snowman begins terrorizing them. In desperation, they call on Jesus Christ for help. Jesus arrives and defeats the snowman. Kenny is killed. Nobody seems particularly bothered by this. The short is 3 minutes long. It is made of paper. The animation is genuinely primitive. The jokes are crude, and the whole thing has the energy of something made by people who were just finding out what they could get away with. It screens at the department's end-of-year showing, gets some laughs, and then basically disappears into the stack of student projects that get made and forgotten every semester at every film school everywhere. But Parker and Stone have found something. They have found each other, and they have found a style, and they have found an instinct. They spend the rest of their college years making short films together, doing voices, writing scripts, failing and trying again. Parker writes a musical called Cannibal, the musical, based on the true story of a 19th century Colorado frontiersman named Alfred Packer, who was accused of killing and eating his companions during a winter expedition. The film is shot on Loveland Pass during the winter of 1993 with a budget scraped together from family and friends. Parker directs, writes, and stars. Stone produces and acts. The result is a fully realized musical comedy featuring songs about cannibalism performed in a style that openly parodies Oklahoma. It is deranged and funny and completely sincere about both of those things simultaneously. They submit it to Sundance. Sundance does not respond. Parker, convinced they need to be at the festival, rents a conference room at a nearby hotel and holds his own screening. MTV shows up. They get noticed. The film eventually sells to Trauma Entertainment and gets retitled, and when South Park later becomes famous, Cannibal becomes something of a cult classic that fans discover while trying to understand where all of this came from. But the main line of what will eventually become South Park still needs one more step. It needs to escape the university. It needs to find an audience beyond the students who crowded into those end-of-semester screenings. That step comes when they move to Los Angeles. Parker and Stone arrive in Los Angeles in the mid-90s carrying almost nothing. Stone later recalled sleeping on dirty laundry for over a year because he couldn't afford to buy a mattress. They are broke, they are unknown, and they are working constantly, making short films, pitching ideas, trying to get someone to pay attention. They pitch a children's show to Fox called Time Warped, a concept involving fictionalized stories about historical figures, and make 2 separate pilots before Fox cancels the kids' division entirely, taking the show down with it. They keep working. They meet lawyers and agents and producers. They write scripts. Parker makes a feature film called Orgasmo about a Mormon missionary who accidentally becomes a pornography star, which gets an NC-17 rating, and essentially no theatrical distribution, though it builds a small, devoted following of people who find it through alternative channels. And through all of this, they keep the paper animation style in the back of their minds. They know there's something there, they just need someone to see it. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something kind of wonderful about knowing people are lying in bed in completely different parts of the world listening to the same story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time. It genuinely helps us keep making these for you. Section 2. Jesus versus Santa. The short that went viral before viral was a thing. In 1995, a Fox Broadcasting Company executive named Brian Graden came across Parker and Stone through a mutual connection. Graden had seen their student work, had seen the energy in what they were doing, and was charmed by the crude construction paper animation and the absolutely fearless approach to subject matter. Graden had a specific request, and it was an unusual one. He wanted a Christmas card, not a physical card, a video Christmas card, something he could send to his friends and colleagues as a novelty, a funny thing to share around the holidays in a time when sharing anything digitally still felt novel and slightly futuristic. He was willing to pay Parker and Stone $2,000 to make it. They accepted, kept the production budget at around $750, and spent the rest. What they made was called The Spirit of Christmas, though it would later be retroactively nicknamed Jesus versus Santa to distinguish it from their earlier student short. It is 5 minutes long. It features 4 children, recognizable now as the prototypes of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, standing in what looks like a small, snowy Colorado town. Jesus Christ arrives, trailing an aura of divine light. Santa Claus arrives in his sleigh, and then, with absolutely no preamble and a sort of gleeful inevitability, Jesus and Santa begin beating the living hell out of each other. The children watch. They swear constantly. Kenny gets killed. Kyle is established as Jewish. The animation looks like someone made it out of construction paper because someone did make it out of construction paper. The jokes are filthy, and the whole thing radiates an energy of complete conviction. Parker and Stone are not making something raunchy for its own sake. They are making something that genuinely amuses them, and that quality comes through in every frame. Graden loved it. He sent it to approximately 80 friends and colleagues in December of 1995. One of those people, according to various accounts over the years, was George Clooney, who reportedly made 300 copies of the tape and distributed them widely. Whether or not that specific story is entirely accurate, what happened next is documented clearly. The tape spread. It was copied onto VHS and passed around Hollywood. Someone digitized it and posted it online. In an era when most people were still using dial-up internet connections and a video file could take hours to download, people were downloading this 5-minute cartoon anyway, gathering around office computers to watch it, sending the file to their friends, passing bootleg copies around like contraband. The Spirit of Christmas became what is widely regarded as one of the first genuinely viral internet videos. It predates YouTube by a full decade. It predates most social media by longer than that. It spread through the pure primitive mechanism of person-to-person enthusiasm. People found it funny, so they shared it. And those people found it funny and shared it further. And within months, without any marketing budget or studio backing or promotional strategy, This crude little paper animation was being watched all over the country by people who had no idea who made it or how to find more. There is something worth sitting with here in the quiet of wherever you are right now. Because the mechanism by which the spirit of Christmas spread was not some corporate distribution strategy or carefully planned marketing rollout. It was just people finding something funny and wanting their friends to see it too. In 1995, before anyone had a name for what that process was, before anyone had built platforms to facilitate it, before the word viral had been applied to anything except biological pathogens, Parker and Stone made something in their apartment with scissors and paper and an 8mm camera, and it spread around the country on the strength of people being unable to keep it to themselves. That quality, the thing that makes someone say you have to watch this, has been the engine of South Park's audience for its entire existence. Every major spike in viewership over the decades has corresponded to some moment when the show said or did something so precise, so unexpected, so genuinely surprising that people who saw it felt compelled to share it. The internet has made that process faster and more visible, but it was already happening in 1995, on VHS tapes and computer files that took 45 minutes to download. For Parker and Stone, who were in Los Angeles trying to make a living and mostly failing, the buzz from the short was electric but also completely beyond their control. They hadn't authorized the distribution. They hadn't planned for it. They had made a Christmas card for one executive and watched it escape into the world and become something else entirely. The chaos of it, the way it propagated without permission, the way it found its own audience through underground channels rather than official ones, was in many ways a preview of what the show itself would do for the next 3 decades. Comedy Central, which at that point was a small cable network, still figuring out what it wanted to be, took notice. The network's executive, Doug Herzog, watched the short and responded to it immediately. He saw the audience that was responding to it online and through the bootleg circuit. He understood, in a way that the focus groups and the standards departments hadn't quite managed yet, that there was a real appetite for exactly this kind of content, animation that looked like it was made for children, combined with material that was absolutely not intended for children, delivered with complete sincerity and evident joy. Herzog commissioned Parker and Stone to develop the short into a full series. The development process was not smooth. Comedy Central originally ordered just 6 episodes, a bare minimum, enough to see whether the thing could actually be made into a television show. Parker and Stone took 3 months to create the pilot, working at a pace that was almost comically slow compared to what the production would eventually become. The pilot was animated almost entirely by hand, with actual construction paper cutouts photographed frame by frame. The same technique Parker had been using since the student films. It was painstaking and exhausting, and the result looked exactly like what it was. Handmade, crude, and oddly beautiful. The pilot episode cost approximately $300,000 to produce, which was considered reasonable for a cable pilot. It established the town, the characters, the dynamic, the tone. Parker and Stone spent that 3-month production period essentially locked in a room, cutting paper and talking to each other, finding the voices of characters who had existed in rough prototype form for years and now needed to become fully realized presences. The voice of Cartman, in particular, was something Parker worked on extensively. A specific kind of wheedling, self-righteous, entitled register that felt completely distinct from any previous animated character voice. A sound that contained within it everything you needed to know about who this child was before you even knew what he was saying. But before the show aired, before it even had a contract, there was a focus group. Comedy Central ran the pilot past a test audience. The test audience hated it. Specifically, women in the test audience responded negatively, finding the content offensive and the characters unlikable. The network's executives wavered. There was serious consideration of simply not proceeding with the show. What saved it, according to various accounts, was a combination of factors. The continuing buzz from the Spirit of Christmas short kept demonstrating that there was a real audience for this material online. And a Comedy Central executive named Eileen Katz believed in it fiercely. She later told Variety, in a quote that has since become somewhat legendary in the history of the show, that very rarely in your life do you hear a pitch and see the finished product and feel the planets align, birds sing, and rainbows appear? And she felt that watching the South Park pilot, which is a remarkable thing to say about a show whose first episode is titled Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. But she was not wrong. The planets were aligning. They were just aligning around something that a significant percentage of the population was going to find deeply, genuinely offensive. Les Claypool and the members of Primus, a California rock band that Parker and Stone both loved deeply, were approached to compose the theme song. Claypool has said in interviews that when they first heard about the project, there was absolutely no reason to think it would work. It looked like two college kids who had somehow convinced a network to let them make something extremely strange. But they listened to the Spirit of Christmas short and recognized the cleverness in it, and they agreed. Claypool wrote the theme, that deliberately abrasive, bass-heavy instrumental that would become one of the most recognizable pieces of music on American cable television, and it was done. The show had its cast, its music, its animation style, and its network. The only thing left was to actually put it on television and find out what would happen. What happened is the subject of the next section. Section 3, August 13th, 1997. The night South Park arrived. The summer of 1997 felt, from the inside of American television, like a moment of relative calm. The networks were dominant. Cable was growing, but still considered a secondary market, a place for reruns and specialty programming, and the occasional show that couldn't find a home anywhere else. Comedy Central was still a young network, still establishing its identity, still looking for the show that would tell the world what kind of channel it actually was. On August 13th, 1997, that show arrived. Cartman Gets an Anal Probe aired at 10 in the evening, Eastern Time. The plot, such as it was, involved 4 young boys in a small Colorado mountain town dealing with alien visitors who had abducted Kyle's little brother Ike. The aliens had also implanted a device in Cartman that caused him to emit fire from his rear end at unpredictable intervals. The episode featured constant profanity, crude bodily humor, a 10-year-old child shooting laser beams from his backside, and a cheerful matter-of-factness about all of it that was unlike anything that had been on basic cable before. The Nielsen rating for the first episode was a 1.3, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For a cable channel in 1997, that number was considered significant. It was not enormous, it was not a cultural earthquake. But it was enough, and it kept growing. By the time the 8th episode, Damien, aired several months later, the rating had climbed to a 6.4. That number was, at the time, more than 10 times the average rating for a cable show in prime time. South Park was not just the most watched show on Comedy Central. It was, by some measures, the most watched show on basic cable, period. The network that had been quietly growing in households was suddenly growing very fast. The number of American homes with Comedy Central jumped from 9.1 million in 1997 to 50 million by June of 1998. One show, 1 year, 50 million households. That does not happen in television. The show aired originally at 10 in the evening. After the first wave of complaints from parents, Comedy Central moved it to midnight starting in October of 1997. The audience did not shrink. If anything, the later time slot seemed to concentrate the viewership. People who were going to watch South Park were going to stay up to watch South Park, and the midnight time slot gave it an almost underground feel, like something you had to be specifically committed to see. In Canada, Global TV had been airing the show after Seinfeld in a slot that suggested tremendous confidence in the audience it expected to attract. The Canadian broadcast edited out the dildo references from the pilot and removed scenes in which Kyle kicks his baby brother Ike. Even with those cuts, complaints arrived. The show was moved to a later time slot. The complaints continued. South Park was becoming, in a very short period of time, the show that parents genuinely did not want their children watching, which meant, of course, that children everywhere were desperately trying to watch it. What made the show so immediately galvanizing was not simply the profanity or the crude humor, though those were certainly part of it. It was the cognitive dissonance. South Park looked like a children's program. The animation was deliberately simplistic, made to look like paper cutouts, using flat shapes and basic colors. The characters were small, round-headed children in winter coats. The setting was an idyllic small town in the Colorado mountains with snow-covered streets and a friendly school. Everything about the visual presentation said innocent, and then the characters opened their mouths and the content was the opposite of innocent in almost every conceivable way. Ray Richmond, reviewing the show for Variety in August 1997, described it as Peanuts meets A Clockwork Orange, which remains one of the most accurate things anyone has ever said about the show. The innocence of Peanuts, the round-headed children, the flat colors, the gentle small-town atmosphere, combined with the ultraviolence and transgressive satire of Stanley Kubrick's dystopian classic. That combination was genuinely new. There was nothing on American television that prepared audiences for it. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog group that would become a near-constant presence in the show's early years, called South Park so offensive it should never have been made. Schools in New Jersey began warning parents about the show's content. Hickory Flat Elementary in Georgia issued an outright ban on South Park clothing, t-shirts, hats, anything with the characters on it. A headmaster at a school in Cambridge, England, publicly urged parents to stop allowing their children to watch after British children began engaging with the show through satellite television. And then, in 1999, a polling organization conducted a survey among 8- and 9-year-old children in the United Kingdom, asking them to name their favorite personality. Not their favorite fictional character, their favorite personality. The winner was Eric Cartman, an animated 10-year-old from Colorado who was overweight, anti-Semitic, manipulative, and possessed of a moral compass that pointed consistently in the direction of whatever was worst for everyone around him. Parent councils were horrified. Cartman was beating out real human beings in children's popularity polls, and he was doing it by being the worst version of a person imaginable. But here's the thing that the criticism often missed, or deliberately avoided acknowledging. Even in the very first season, underneath all the profanity and shock humor, there was something more happening. The fourth episode, which aired on September 3rd, 1997, was called Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride. In it, Stan's dog Sparky turns out to be gay, and in trying to come to terms with this, Stan encounters Big Gay Al, an exuberantly happy gay man who runs a sanctuary for abandoned gay animals. The episode is, by any honest assessment, one of the warmest and most sympathetic portrayals of a gay character that American television had produced to that point. It was nominated for a Gilead Award for Outstanding TV Individual Episode. The same season that was being called Corrupting and Dangerous produced something that a gay advocacy organization felt was worth honoring. That tension between the show that was being condemned and the show that was actually being made would persist for the entire run. South Park was always both things at once. It was the crude shock comedy that parents were afraid of, and the thoughtful social commentary that critics were underestimating, and neither characterization was entirely wrong. The voice work in the early episodes established the template that would hold for decades. Parker and Stone do the majority of the character voices themselves. Parker voices Stan, Cartman, Randy Marsh, Mr. Garrison, Timmy, and dozens of recurring and one-off characters. Stone voices Kyle, Kenny, Butters, Jimmy, Craig, and an equally enormous roster of others. The efficiency this creates is remarkable. It means the show can add new characters or bring back obscure ones without the logistics of scheduling additional voice actors. And it means the entire vocal universe of the show exists inside the heads of two people who have been working together since a film class in Colorado. Mary Kay Bergman provided the voices for virtually all female characters in the early seasons. Wendy Testaberger, Shelley Marsh, Mrs. Broflovsky, and others, with a flexibility and range that made the small cast feel much larger. Her death in November of 1999 was a devastating loss to the show's early team, and her contribution to building the sound of South Park in its foundational years is difficult to overstate. Isaac Hayes joined the show as the voice of Chef, Jerome McElroy, the school cafeteria worker who functioned as the closest thing to a responsible adult in the children's lives. Hayes was already a legend, the composer and performer of the Shaft theme, a soul and funk musician whose career stretched back decades. His warm, smooth baritone gave Chef a warmth and dignity that balanced the chaos around him, and his willingness to sing essentially anything Parker and Stone wrote for the character, no matter how inappropriate, became one of the show's running pleasures. The Chef songs were elaborate R&B productions dropped into the middle of surreal storylines, and Hayes committed to every single one of them completely. By the end of the first season, South Park was already something that had never quite existed before on television. It was rude and funny and surprisingly heartfelt, and it was growing faster than almost anyone had predicted. Section 4. Cartman, Kyle, Stan, and Kenny, building a world out of paper. To understand South Park fully, you need to understand the four boys at the center of it. Not just as characters, but as a kind of moral architecture. The way they embody different positions in the show's ongoing argument with itself about what kind of world it inhabits and what kind of people are worth being. Stan Marsh is, in the show's own description, the average American boy. He is modeled primarily on Trey Parker, or at least on Parker's idea of himself, and he functions as the audience's primary point of entry into most storylines. Stan is decent, basically. He cares about doing the right thing. He gets disgusted by the things going on around him, often literally. He vomits whenever his elementary school girlfriend, Wendy Testaberger, talks to him. A running gag that says something about the show's understanding of romantic feelings at a young age that is both accurate and deeply unkind. In later seasons, Stan becomes more complicated, more prone to cynicism, more reflective. The show uses him to examine what happens to an idealistic person as they encounter more and more evidence that the world doesn't particularly reward idealism. Kyle Broflovsky is the moral voice. He is Jewish in a town with very few Jewish families, and his faith and his sense of ethics are constantly under pressure from the world around him, and specifically from Cartman, whose anti-Semitism is cartoonish in scale but has real edges underneath it. Kyle is modeled on Matt Stone, who grew up in Littleton, Colorado, and who has spoken about the way the show uses Kyle's Jewish identity to explore questions of otherness and belonging in a place that is otherwise almost entirely homogeneous. Kyle gives the most impassioned speeches. He is the one who most often says the quiet thing out loud, who articulates what the episode has actually been about once the chaos settles. He is in many ways the show's conscience. Kenny McCormick comes from a poor family, wears an orange parka hood pulled so tightly around his face that virtually nothing of his features is visible, and his speech is rendered almost entirely unintelligible. In the early seasons, Kenny dies in every single episode, run over by a car, hit by lightning, eviscerated by something falling from the sky, and returns in the next episode with no explanation offered, and no one seeming to remember what happened. It is a gag about the casual nature of death in entertainment, about the way violence in children's media is treated as consequence-free, and it has a strange sweetness to it when you consider that Kenny always comes back. In later seasons, the mythology around Kenny deepens in ways that recontextualize the whole running gag as something almost poignant. And then there is Eric Theodore Cartman, the character who changed everything. Cartman is overweight, lazy, manipulative, casually racist, specifically and elaborately anti-Semitic, and possessed of a self-regard so enormous it functions almost as its own weather system. He wants what he wants with an intensity that overwhelms every obstacle, and the things he wants are almost always petty or cruel or both. He is modeled, at least partially, on Archie Bunker, the bigoted everyman from All in the Family, but Cartman goes places Archie never went. Archie was a recognizable human type. Cartman is something else, a child who is simultaneously absurd and genuinely menacing, who can be devastating and hilarious in the same sentence, whose worst impulses are presented with such cheerful explicitness that you find yourself laughing at things you are not certain you should be laughing at. Parker and Stone have both said in interviews that they personally identify with Cartman more than with any other character, which is either concerning or illuminating depending on how you look at it. What they seem to mean is that Cartman gives them permission to go wherever the joke requires, to follow the logic of a situation all the way to its most extreme, most uncomfortable conclusion, without the modifying influence of decency. Cartman is the part of every writer's brain that knows exactly what the most inappropriate thing to say would be, and says it anyway, and then watches what happens. The world around these four boys is drawn with a consistency and affection that rewards the kind of patient attention that sleep-deprived watching at midnight tends to produce. South Park, Colorado is a small mountain town that contains an improbable concentration of bizarre events: alien abductions, cult infiltrations, celebrity scandals, supernatural visitations, while remaining recognizably a real place. The school, the streets, the mountains visible in the background of every exterior shot, they are the same streets and mountains that Parker and Stone grew up seeing, rendered in flat colors and simple shapes that somehow carry genuine weight. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, deserves his own paragraph. He begins the show as a straightforward parental figure and gradually, over the course of the seasons, becomes something else entirely. A stand-in for a certain kind of American adult male, perpetually enthusiastic about whatever the current cultural moment demands, perpetually wrong in ways that are both infuriating and recognizable. Randy has a geologist's knowledge that he deploys in completely inappropriate contexts, a capacity for self-delusion that would be tragic if it weren't so persistently funny, and in later seasons a marijuana farm called Tegrity Farms that functions as a running commentary on brand identity and integrity and what happens when you attach either concept to a genuinely terrible person. Randy Marsh became, over time, one of the funniest characters in the show's long history, and the transformation is interesting to watch in retrospect. The town also contains Mr. Garrison, the elementary school teacher whose psychology becomes increasingly elaborate over the years, including multiple gender transitions, and in one of the show's most sustained satirical commitments, eventually becoming a stand-in for Donald Trump in later seasons, a role that required the character to undergo a grotesque political metamorphosis that Parker and Stone tracked with remarkable consistency. Chef, as already mentioned, provided warmth and soul. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor who ends every sentence with the word "mum-K," became a beloved recurring figure. Officer Barbrady was the town's entirely incompetent policeman. And Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, a talking piece of excrement, who serves as South Park's analog to Santa Claus, became improbably a genuine holiday tradition for the show's audience, appearing annually for years. The show was built from its very foundations as a place with its own internal logic, its own geography, its own recurring relationships and histories. That density of consistent world-building is part of what makes the long-form storytelling of later seasons possible. You can do almost anything in South Park, Colorado, as long as you do it according to the rules of South Park, Colorado. Section 5, The April Fool, The Cliffhanger, and Basic Cable History. By the end of the first season, the ratings trajectory of South Park had done something remarkable. The show had gone from 980,000 viewers on its premiere to a 6.4 rating by the time Damien aired, and it showed no signs of slowing down. Comedy Central, which had been cautiously building its schedule around the show's success, now understood that it had something genuinely unprecedented on its hands. Season 1 ended with an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which established a mystery that would hold the show's audience in suspense for months. Who is Cartman's father? The episode ends without answering the question, leaving the identity of the person who fathered Eric Cartman as a season-spanning cliffhanger to be resolved in the Season 2 premiere. For a show that had been on the air for less than a year, it was an audacious structural move, and it worked. Viewers genuinely wanted to know. Season 2 was scheduled to begin on April 1st, 1998. April Fool's Day. Parker and Stone knew this, and they could not resist. Instead of the promised resolution to the Cartman's father mystery, the Season 2 premiere aired an episode called Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. The title is a parody of Not Without My Daughter, a 1991 Sally Field film. The episode is 22 minutes of Canadian flatulence humor. It follows Terrence and Phillip, the fictional Canadian comedy duo from the show within the show that the South Park children love and the parents despise, as they attempt to stop Saddam Hussein from taking over Canada. There is no Stan. There is no Kyle. There is no Cartman. There is no answer to the cliffhanger. There are approximately 11,000 fart jokes, depending on how you count. Comedy Central received over 2,000 angry emails within a week. Their phone lines were flooded. Fans felt genuinely betrayed. People who had been looking forward to this episode for months found themselves watching 22 minutes of Canadian flatulence comedy delivered with total commitment. Some viewers left the show permanently and never returned. Stone's public response to the outrage was magnificently unapologetic. He told Entertainment Weekly that if you get that angry over not knowing who a construction paper kid's father is, something is genuinely wrong with you. The actual answer to the Cartman's father mystery arrived 3 weeks later, on April 22, 1998, in an episode called Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut. That episode earned an 8.2 rating, 6.2 million viewers, which made it, at the time, the highest-rated non-sports program in the entire history of basic cable television. During the spring of 1998, 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on basic cable were South Park episodes. The show was not just successful, it was a phenomenon. And the April Fool's prank had actually increased the payoff when the real episode finally arrived. Parker and Stone learned something crucial from this experience. Controversy is not just tolerable. Properly managed, it is an asset. Pissing off your audience does not necessarily cost you your audience. Sometimes it deepens their investment, makes them more passionate, gives them something to argue about that keeps them talking about you even when they are angry. The relationship between South Park and its viewers would be defined by this dynamic for decades. The show would surprise, frustrate, and occasionally enrage the people who loved it most, and those people would keep watching. The era around 1998 also marked the moment when South Park became a serious merchandising phenomenon. T-shirts and hats and posters were everywhere. Paramount's licensing arm expanded distribution to major retailers, including Target and JCPenney, carefully removing the most objectionable imagery from the merchandise to make it palatable to mainstream retail. JCPenney eventually ended its South Park partnership in April 1999 after customer complaints. Fast food chains refused to associate with the show's content entirely. The show was simultaneously one of the most recognizable brands in American popular culture and essentially unmerchandisable through the most traditional commercial channels, because the content that made it iconic was the same content that made mainstream brands want to keep their distance. Around this same period, something happened that has since been largely forgotten, but is genuinely remarkable. The 1995 Spirit of Christmas short was secretly included on the data disc for a video game called Tiger Woods 99, released for the original PlayStation by Electronic Arts. The short was hidden as a file labeled with an obscure file name on the game disc, accessible to anyone who put the disc into a computer drive rather than a game console. The game was rated E for everyone by the ESRB. When parents discovered that their children's golf game contained a cartoon in which Jesus and Santa Claus beat each other senseless while children screamed obscenities, Electronic Arts recalled the game in January of 1999 and replaced it. It is one of the stranger moments in the history of both gaming and South Park, the show's most underground artifact finding its way into a children's product through the enthusiasm of an EA employee who was apparently a fan. The late 1990s also marked the beginning of South Park's relationship with its own meta-commentary. The Season 1 episode called Death, which aired in September of 1997, featured a show within the show, Terrence and Phillip, that the parents of South Park found disgusting and offensive, while the children loved it. The parents mounted a campaign to have the show canceled. The episode was a direct parody of the real-world reaction to South Park itself, with the fictional show functioning as a mirror image of the real one. 2 months into its run, South Park was already commenting on its own cultural impact, using its own critics as characters in its ongoing self-examination. Most shows take years to develop that kind of reflexive awareness of their own place in the culture. South Park was born with it. Section 6. All Hell Breaks Loose. The movie. By January of 1998, South Park was successful enough that conversations about a theatrical feature film had become serious. The business case was obvious. The show was drawing millions of viewers on a cable network, and translating that audience to theaters seemed entirely plausible. Parker and Stone were interested, but they had conditions. Their primary condition was non-negotiable. The film must receive at least an R rating. The whole point of a feature film, from their perspective, was to do things the television show could not do. To push further, go harder. Take the comedy to places that Comedy Central's standards department would never allow on the network itself. Paramount Pictures, which would distribute the film, reportedly floated the idea of targeting a PG-13 rating. Parker and Stone's response was immediate and unambiguous. No. Stone told Entertainment Weekly at the time that they were using Paramount's money to make the most elaborate, sustained middle finger to the motion picture Association of America that had ever been attempted. They were trying, explicitly and deliberately, to offend the MPAA into giving the film the most restrictive rating they could justify, and then fighting those restrictions for every single joke they had written. The film was originally titled South Park: All Hell Breaks Loose. The MPAA rejected the title, reportedly objecting to the word hell in the title of an animated film. Parker and Stone counterproposed South Park: Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, a title that is, in the most obvious possible way, a phallic joke. The MPAA approved it, apparently without realizing this, and the title was locked. The production of the film was genuinely hectic. Parker and Stone were simultaneously running the third season of the television show and attempting to make a Broadway-caliber animated musical. The film features 12 original songs, all of them fully orchestrated, with lyrics and music primarily by Parker, in collaboration with composer Mark Shaman. The songs range from the genuinely affecting Kyle's Mom ballad becomes a massive Broadway production number, to the defiantly outrageous, including a song called Uncle Something, in which an extremely offensive word is used 31 times in under 3 minutes. The total word count for the finished film, once all the profanity was compiled, was 399 uses of offensive language, which Parker and Stone understood at the time would put them right at the edge of what the MPAA would allow. 400 was understood to guarantee an NC-17 rating, and stopping at 399 was both a technical calculation and a perfect joke. The film was submitted to the MPAA 6 separate times. It received an NC-17 rating on each of the first 5 submissions. Parker and Stone negotiated over individual jokes, individual words, individual scenes, not trying to make the film less offensive, but trying to make it differently offensive in ways that would navigate the MPAA's internally inconsistent standards. The MPAA would object to one scene, they would change it, and something else would trigger an objection in turn. The entire process was a demonstration of exactly what the film was arguing. The standards applied to language and sex in American entertainment are arbitrary, inconsistent, and applied without coherent principle. Violence is generally acceptable. Language is not. The film's plot, in which a moral panic over children hearing swear words in a Canadian comedy film leads to the United States declaring war on Canada, was designed to illustrate this precise absurdity, and the production process of the film was illustrating it simultaneously in real life. On the 6th submission, with minor adjustments that Stone and Parker have been characteristically vague about in interviews, the film received an R rating. It had approximately 2 weeks to spare before its theatrical release. South Park: Bigger, Longer, and Uncut opened on June 30th, 1999. It was 2 months and 10 days after the Columbine High School shooting in Littleton, Colorado, the school district where Matt Stone had grown up, the same Littleton where he had attended Heritage High School. The film, which had been written and developed entirely before the shooting, was suddenly releasing into a cultural moment defined by exactly the kind of discourse it was satirizing. The argument that violent and offensive entertainment was responsible for real-world violence. Parker and Stone had to decide whether to go forward with a film arguing against that position at a moment when the argument felt more charged than at any previous point in their careers. They went forward. They felt that pulling the film would be exactly the kind of reflexive, panic-driven censorship the film was criticizing. They were frightened about how it would be received. It received, on balance, remarkably warmly. Critics who might have been expected to condemn it often found themselves charmed by how genuinely funny it was, how technically accomplished the music was, how effectively the satire landed. Roger Ebert gave it 2.5 stars and admitted to feeling offended. Jack Valenti, the president of the MPAA, later said he regretted giving the film an R rating and felt it should have been NC-17 in partial response to the controversy around the film's rating and the broader discourse about content and entertainment. The MPAA expanded its rating system in 2000 to include more detailed content descriptors alongside each rating, a change that remains in effect today. The film grossed over $83 million worldwide against a production budget of approximately $21 million. It became the highest-grossing R-rated animated film in history at that time, a record it held until Seth Rogen's Sausage Party in 2016. And a song from the film, Blame Canada, a rousing chorus-driven number in which the American parents campaigned to go to war with Canada over the entertainment their children have been exposed to, was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Robin Williams performed a sanitized version of the song at the Oscar ceremony, which is a sentence that would have been essentially impossible to predict 12 months earlier. South Park, the show that had started as a Christmas card made from construction paper in someone's apartment, had a song at the Academy Awards. And Parker and Stone attended. They wore ball gowns. Parker arrived at the 72nd Academy Awards wearing a pink dress inspired by the gown Gwyneth Paltrow had worn to the Oscars the previous year. Stone wore a lavender dress that was a replica of the dress Jennifer Lopez had famously worn to the Grammy Awards earlier that year. They had, by their own account, taken LSD before the ceremony. They walked the red carpet in full evening gowns, greeted their industry colleagues, sat through the ceremony, watched Robin Williams perform a child-friendly version of their song about going to war with Canada, and then presumably went home to Colorado and started writing more episodes of their cartoon. The Academy let them in. What else were they going to do? They were the creators of one of the most successful animated films of the year, nominated for one of the evening's most prestigious awards. The gowns were a provocation, clearly, but they were a provocation the Academy had no real mechanism for refusing. The event has its own logic, its own momentum, and two men in expensive dresses who were there legitimately were simply part of the evening's texture. What this moment illustrates is something that gets missed when people talk about Parker and Stone primarily in terms of their controversies. They are not performing transgression. They are not being edgy for the purpose of being edgy. They show up to the Oscars in dresses because that is genuinely the kind of thing they find funny. Because they see the gap between the pomposity of the ceremony and the absurdity of the human beings performing within it. And they want to live in that gap rather than pretend it isn't there. The same impulse that makes them put Saddam Hussein in a relationship with Satan makes them wear Jennifer Lopez's Grammy dress to the most formal event in Hollywood. It is not a strategy. It is a personality. Saddam Hussein, depicted in the film as Satan's manipulative and abusive boyfriend residing in hell, was something Parker and Stone took particular pleasure in. Parker has said in interviews that he had always hoped the real Saddam Hussein would see the movie. Stone later joked, while Hussein was on trial for crimes against humanity in 2006, that the U.S. military had been repeatedly showing the film to Hussein as a form of psychological pressure. Whether or not that is even partially accurate, it is true that the film reached Hussein through various international channels, and that the image of himself as Satan's petulant boyfriend was precisely the kind of absurdist humiliation that would have been impossible to ignore. Section 7. 6 days to air. How South Park invented itself every week. Beginning with the 4th season, which started airing in April of 2000, South Park undertook one of the most audacious and genuinely unusual production commitments in the history of American television. Each episode of South Park, 22 minutes of animated comedy, would be written, voiced, animated, edited, and delivered to Comedy Central in approximately 6 days. 6 days. The Simpsons at that time was taking between 6 and 8 months to produce each episode. Traditional animation studios generally operated on similar timelines. Hand-drawn animation is extraordinarily labor-intensive, and the process from script to finished product requires extensive planning, large teams, and significant production time. Even fully computer-animated productions in the early 2000s typically took months per episode. South Park could do it in 6 days because of a combination of factors. The animation style, while sophisticated in its execution, is designed to look deliberately simple: flat shapes, limited movement, character designs that don't require the kind of detailed rendering that would slow production. The computer software the show uses, primarily Autodesk Maya, allows the team to produce animation much faster than traditional techniques. And crucially, Parker serves as the show's primary writer, director, and voice actor simultaneously. A consolidation of creative roles that eliminates the kinds of back-and-forth negotiations between departments that slow down most production pipelines. The process, as described by everyone who has participated in it, works something like this. On Thursday, Parker and Stone begin thinking about what the episode will be. They might have a vague idea from conversations the previous week, or they might be starting completely fresh. By the end of Thursday, they need to have a concept. Not a script, not a structure, just a premise. What is this episode about? On Friday and Saturday, the premise becomes a structure. On Sunday and Monday, the writing gets done in earnest. By Tuesday, recording sessions have begun, because the animation team needs the vocal performances to build the characters' lip movements around. Wednesday is the final push. The all-nighter, the race to the finish, the episode being transmitted to Comedy Central's East Coast offices, sometimes with only hours to spare before it is scheduled to air. The documentary 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford and premiered on Comedy Central on October 9, 2011, captures this process in detail that is simultaneously fascinating and exhausting to watch. You see Parker pacing the writer's room at 2 in the morning, working through the structure of an episode whose script he won't finish until the following morning. You see voice sessions being recorded while animation is still being built around the dialogue. You see the entire team operating on the edge of what is physically possible, and you see Parker's face during the moments when it seems like the episode genuinely might not get done. Not frustrated exactly, but concentrated in a way that suggests the entire weight of 20 years of doing this is sitting directly behind his eyes. There is a moment in the documentary where Parker talks about the terror of the blank page, the anxiety of starting from nothing every single week, of knowing that whatever the episode will be, it doesn't exist yet. And the only way it will exist is through the specific and unrepeatable effort of this particular team in this particular week. He says, in substance, that the fear of not being funny is worse than the fear of being offensive. That the thing that keeps him up at night is not whether the episode will upset someone. It is whether the episode will be good. This is, I think, the most important thing to understand about South Park. The controversies are real, and their consequences have been real, and some of them have caused genuine harm to specific people. But they are the byproduct of a creative process whose primary anxiety is entirely internal. Parker and Stone are not sitting in a room figuring out how to offend people. They are sitting in a room trying to make each other laugh. The controversy is a side effect, not the goal. The 6-day production schedule was Parker and Stone's deliberate choice, not a constraint imposed on them. They could have asked for more time. The network would almost certainly have given it to them. But they found that the pressure created something valuable, a spontaneity, a rawness, an inability to second-guess and revise and sand down every joke until it had lost whatever dangerous quality made it funny in the first place. Working fast meant working on instinct, and their instincts were the show's greatest resource. The schedule also means something else. Every South Park episode is essentially a live reaction to the world as it exists in the week before it airs. When something happens in the news on a Tuesday, Parker and Stone can have an episode about it on Wednesday of the following week. No other scripted show on television has ever matched that turnaround. It means South Park functions less like a traditional animated series and more like a late-night comedy show, responsive, topical, willing to be rough around the edges if that roughness is the price of being current. One of the earliest demonstrations of this capability came in the Season 4 episode, Quintuplets 2000, which referenced the U.S. Border Patrol's raid on a house during the Elian Gonzalez immigration case, an event that had occurred just 4 days before the episode aired. 4 days from news event to finished episode. That is a production velocity that has never been replicated. The 2011 premiere, chronicled in the documentary, was for an episode called Human Centipede, a parody of the horror film The Human Centipede, in which Kyle gets surgically attached to an iPad, Asahi, and another human being, rendered in flat construction paper animation, as a consequence of clicking agree on an iTunes terms and conditions agreement without reading it. The episode was simultaneously disgusting, legally precise about terms of service agreements, and completed in 6 days. This is also the period in which Parker and Stone began most aggressively exploring the potential of the medium outside the show itself. In 2004, they released Team America: World Police, a feature film using marionette puppets filmed in miniature sets to satirize American foreign policy and action movies. The film features puppets having explicit sex, puppets vomiting elaborately, and a climactic speech about the relationship between dicks, pussies, and assholes that serves as its thesis statement on geopolitics. It is completely insane and intermittently brilliant, and its production required Parker and Stone to work in a medium they had never previously attempted with the same commitment and precision they brought to everything else. The Book of Mormon was already being developed during this period, in conversations between Parker, Stone, and songwriter Robert Lopez that began around 2003 and would continue, worked on in whatever time remained after South Park and Team America for the better part of a decade. But the television show was always the center of gravity. Everything else orbited it. The pace of production had changed the show's relationship with current events in ways that would only become more pronounced over time. When a news story broke in any given week, the question in the South Park writers' room was immediately, what is the angle? What is the thing nobody else has said? Where is the absurdity that everyone else is pretending not to notice? And because they had 6 days, they could answer that question and put it on television before the news cycle had fully processed the original story. Section 8. Trapped in the Closet. Scientology, Tom Cruise, and the True Story of Isaac Hayes. November 16, 2005. Season 9, Episode 12. Written and directed by Trey Parker, who credits himself as John Smith. Trapped in the Closet. Before this episode, virtually no mainstream entertainment property had taken a direct, comprehensive run at Scientology. The church was famously litigious, prepared to pursue legal action against critics, journalists, and former members with a persistence and resource depth that had effectively discouraged most media organizations from engaging with it seriously. The entertainment industry, in particular, existed in a complicated relationship with the church because several of its most prominent members were major Hollywood stars, and their lawyers were always close at hand. Parker and Stone didn't care. The episode follows Stan Marsh as he encounters Scientology recruiters who administer the organization's standard personality test and discover that Stan's thetan levels, the measurement of spiritual ability in Scientology's system, are off the charts. They declare that Stan is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the science fiction writer who founded the church in the 1950s. This brings a cascade of Scientology officials and celebrity members to Stan's home, including Tom Cruise and John Travolta. Stan tells Cruise honestly that he thinks his movies are just okay. Cruise, devastated by this assessment, retreats to Stan's closet and refuses to come out. The episode presents Scientology's actual mythology, the story of Xenu, the galactic overlord, the volcanoes, the thetans, the whole elaborate cosmology that the church generally only reveals to members who have invested significant money and time, on screen with a title card that reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe. Not a parody of their beliefs, not an exaggerated version." The real thing, presented in flat construction paper animation. The episode earned a 9.1 on IMDb, making it one of the most acclaimed in the show's entire history. And the response was extraordinary. The day after the episode aired, November 17, 2005, a high-ranking Scientology executive named Mike Rinder, who would later leave the church and become one of its most prominent critics, wrote an internal memo to church leader David Miscavige detailing the response strategy. This memo was eventually made public. The church was mobilizing immediately, working with publicists and lawyers to determine how to neutralize the episode's impact. Then came what the press would call Closetgate. The episode was scheduled for a rebroadcast on March 15, 2006. Comedy Central pulled it at the last minute, replacing it with an episode from Season 2 called Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls. The network's official explanation was that the programming change was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had announced his departure from the show 2 days earlier. Multiple media outlets reported a different explanation. Tom Cruise had threatened to refuse to participate in the promotional tour for Mission Impossible 3, a Paramount film distributed by Viacom, which also owned Comedy Central, unless the episode was pulled. Cruise's representatives denied this. The timing made many people skeptical of that denial. Parker and Stone issued a statement through their lawyer. The statement was signed by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. That is the entire content of the statement. It is, to anyone who knows Parker and Stone, exactly what you would expect them to say. And then there is Isaac Hayes, Shep. The warmest, most beloved character on the show, voiced for 9 years by one of the most respected soul musicians in American recording history. The press release that arrived on March 13, 2006 stated that Hayes was departing South Park over the show's treatment of religion, that there is a place for satire, but that the show had crossed a line into intolerance and bigotry. The statement was eloquent, formally written, and cited Hayes' history as a civil rights activist. Matt Stone's public response was blunt. This is 100% about Scientology. Hayes had been cashing checks from a show that mocked Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and essentially every other major religion for 9 years without objection. His sudden sensitivity coincided exactly with the episode that satirized his own faith. But here's where the story takes a turn that transforms it from an entertainment industry dispute into something genuinely heartbreaking. In January of 2006, 2 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, and 2 months before the departure announcement, Isaac Hayes suffered a major stroke. The stroke severely impaired his ability to speak and to move. He was, according to his son, in no condition to write a press release, make a professional decision, or communicate in any substantive way. In 2016, Isaac Hayes III, the singer's son, told The Hollywood Reporter the truth as he understood it. His father had not quit South Park. At the time of the departure announcement, everyone around Hayes, his assistants, his publicists, his management team, were practicing Scientologists. His father was incapacitated. Someone within his Scientology circle had made the decision and submitted the resignation in his name. Stone confirmed in the same article that this is what he and Parker believe happened. The departure statement was not from Isaac Hayes. It was from the people around Isaac Hayes, acting on his behalf without, his son believes, his genuine knowledge or consent. Hayes died on August 10, 2008 from complications of a second stroke. He was 75 years old. He never fully recovered from the first stroke. Parker and Stone never had the opportunity to reconcile with him before he died. They dedicated the season 12 episode The China Problem to his memory. In the immediate aftermath of the departure announcement, before any of this was known, Parker and Stone responded the only way they knew how. They made an episode. The Return of Chef aired in the week following Hayes' departure announcement. The character of Chef is depicted as having been brainwashed by a fictional cult called the Super Adventure Club, a transparent stand-in for Scientology. The episode uses archival recordings of Hayes' voice, edited and spliced into new dialogue, to show Chef being corrupted. At the end of the episode, Chef is killed in an extremely graphic manner and resurrected as a sinister figure who vows vengeance on the children. It was simultaneously a farewell to the character and a middle finger to Scientology, produced in anger and grief, with the full weight of Parker and Stone's considerable creative energies directed at an institution they felt had taken their friend from them. Looking back, knowing what we now know about Hayes' actual situation at the time, the episode has a tragic dimension that it was impossible to perceive when it aired. They were responding to a betrayal that never quite happened in the way they understood it. Section 9, The Muhammad Years. When comedy became genuinely dangerous. On July 4th, 2001, 2 months before the September 11th attacks changed the world, South Park aired an episode called Super Best Friends. In it, the boys encounter a David Blaine cult and are aided by a team of religious superhero figures: Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Lao Tse, and Muhammad. Muhammad is shown on screen. He has fire powers. He is drawn, visible, named, and portrayed as a fully heroic figure. He is treated with exactly the same irreverence and the same fundamental respect as every other religious figure on the show. Nobody complained. Nobody issued a death threat. The episode aired, people watched it, it was considered a fairly good episode in a strong season, and life went on. Muhammad even appeared in the show's opening title sequence for years, visible in a crowd of characters. Then September 11th happened. And then, in September of 2005, the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad. The response was global and, in some parts of the world, violent. Riots broke out. Embassies were attacked. Over 100 people died in protests. Cartoonists received death threats and went into hiding. The world had fundamentally and irrevocably changed its relationship to the question of visual depictions of the Prophet. In April of 2006, South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars, in which Family Guy, a show the South Park creators had long criticized for what they saw as lazy, consequence-free shock humor, plans to air a depiction of Muhammad. The Muslim world threatens violence. Cartman, for his own petty and selfish reasons, allies himself with the forces trying to censor the episode. Kyle fights for it to air. The episode was a meditation on censorship, free speech, and the specific kind of cowardice that dresses itself as cultural sensitivity. And then Comedy Central did something that made the episode's argument for it. At the moment when Muhammad was to appear on screen within the show, the network inserted a black censorship screen. It read, "Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network." The fiction and the reality had collapsed into each other perfectly. The episode was about a network censoring a cartoon that depicted Muhammad, and the actual network was censoring the actual cartoon that depicted Muhammad in real time as the episode aired. Parker and Stone had written a story about something that then happened to them while the story was being told. What the episode had actually planned to show was benign: Muhammad handing Peter Griffin a football helmet. Not satirical, not mocking. A positive, neutral depiction. Comedy Central refused it and allowed in its place a scene in which Jesus defecates on President Bush and the American flag. You could show that. You could not show Muhammad giving someone a gift. Parker and Stone noted the double standard publicly. The reason for the censorship, they said, was not religious respect. The network had admitted as much. They were afraid of getting bombed. And that admission was, in some ways, more troubling than the censorship itself. Then came the episode that made everything else look minor. In April of 2010, South Park aired its 200th episode, a massive, ambitious celebration of the show's history in which every celebrity who had ever been parodied on the show returned to file a class action lawsuit against the town. The plot required bringing Muhammad to South Park, and the episode showed Muhammad only obscured. Behind a black censorship bar, inside a moving truck, inside a bear costume. They pushed right up to the line they had learned existed. Episode 200 aired on April 14th. The next day, a website called revolutionmuslim.com published a warning. The post included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who had been stabbed and shot to death in Amsterdam in 2004 for making a film critical of the treatment of women under Islam. The post said, in words that the creators of South Park would later describe as genuinely frightening, that Parker and Stone would probably end up the same way if they continued. It included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and Los Angeles. It did not call itself a threat. It called itself a warning about the reality of what would happen. The FBI opened an investigation. The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. For the first time in the show's history, the controversy was not about angry emails or boycotts or corporate pressure. It was about real physical danger. Episode 201, the follow-up, aired on April 21st, 2010. Comedy Central, without consulting Parker and Stone, inserted audio bleeps over every mention of Muhammad's name in the episode. They censored most of the episode's closing section, the 3 final speeches delivered by Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus, which were about the moral of the story, specifically about the relationship between violence, threats, and free speech. Comedy Central censored a speech about censorship. The network beeped out dialogue arguing that threats of violence should not determine what can and cannot be shown on television, and in doing so proved the point the dialogue was making. Parker and Stone were furious. South Park Studios published a statement confirming that the network had inserted censorship without the creators' knowledge or consent. The episode as broadcast was not the episode they had made. On May 1st, just 10 days after episode 201 aired, a car bomb was discovered in Times Square. A sitting congressman publicly speculated that the South Park controversy might have been a motive. The eventual suspect had been planning the attack for months before the episode aired, and the connection was never established. But the fact that the question was being asked publicly tells you how far the situation had escalated. This was no longer a television controversy. It was a matter of national security discourse. Zachary Chesser, the man who had posted the threatening message on revolutionmuslim.com, was arrested in July of 2010. Not primarily for the South Park threats, but for attempting to provide material support to Al-Shabaab, a Somali terrorist organization. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Jesse Curtis Morton, another member of the organization, received 11.5 years. Both episodes 200 and 201 were pulled from Comedy Central's website, removed from streaming platforms, and excluded from syndication. Super Best Friends, the 2001 episode that had aired without any controversy whatsoever, was also pulled from circulation retroactively because it contained a visible depiction of Muhammad. The episode that had been entirely unproblematic for 9 years became unavailable because the world around it had changed. The episode itself had not changed. The context had. For a period of years, these episodes were essentially impossible to watch through any legitimate channel. They existed in an online gray market of fan uploads and archival copies, periodically taken down, periodically re-uploaded. South Park had created content that was too dangerous to show, not because of what it contained, but because of what showing it might cause to happen. Parker later described the period during which they were receiving security details and being warned about their home addresses as genuinely frightening. Not in an abstract way. In the way you are frightened when you understand that the threat is specific and the people making it have demonstrated they are capable of following through. And then Parker and Stone went back to work. The next week, they made another episode. Section 10, Banned in China and the World's Greatest Mock Apology. October 2nd, 2019. Season 23, Episode 2. The 299th episode of South Park overall. The episode is called Banned in China, and it may be the single most geopolitically consequential thing the show has ever done. The story has 2 parallel threads. In one, Stan Marsh forms a death metal band called Crimson Dawn, which attracts the attention of a music producer who wants to make a biographical film about them. As filming begins, the production team starts making changes to the story, subtle at first, then increasingly blatant, to ensure the film will be approved by Chinese government censors. By the end of the episode, the film is unrecognizable, every element that made it interesting having been removed or softened to avoid offending the Chinese Communist Party. In the other storyline, Randy Marsh travels to China to expand his Tegrity Farms marijuana business, seeing the 1.4 billion potential customers as an irresistible market. He is arrested immediately upon arrival, marijuana is discovered in his luggage, and he is sent to a labor camp. In the labor camp, he encounters Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, who have been imprisoned because internet memes comparing President Xi Jinping to the round, honey-loving bear had been spreading online and had caused the Chinese government to ban the character outright. Randy eventually stands before a Chinese court and, in a scene that functions as the episode's moral core, tells the court that business should not be conducted on a foundation of intimidation. That doing business with a government that treats its people this way is the same as endorsing that treatment. The episode was devastatingly direct in a way that most entertainment refused to be. It called out Hollywood studios by name. It referenced the NBA's capitulation to Chinese government pressure. It named Mickey Mouse and Disney as participants in the same dynamic. And it used Randy's line, "You have to lower your ideals of freedom if you want to suck on the warm teat of China," as a crystallization of the argument in a way that became instantly iconic. Within days of the episode's broadcast, South Park had been completely erased from the Chinese internet. Every clip, every episode, every social media post, every discussion. Searches on Weibo returned 0 results. Streaming services that had been carrying the show removed it entirely. The Chinese government's response was comprehensive and immediate. A show that dared to criticize the relationship between China and Western entertainment corporations would simply cease to exist within Chinese borders. Parker and Stone's response was one of the most perfectly calibrated pieces of public communication in the show's history. They published a statement that read, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy." She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China? The statement is a masterwork of mock apology. It references the NBA controversy directly, which was dominating news coverage that same week. Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey had tweeted support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters, and the NBA had responded by frantically apologizing to China and suspending Morey from speaking to the press. South Park saw the most powerful sports league in America performing the most graceless possible genuflection to an authoritarian government, and they pointed at it and laughed. The timing was not coincidental. Parker and Stone were paying close attention to the specific moment in American corporate history when the calculation had shifted, when the Chinese market had become so large and so dependent on good relations with the government that controlled access to it, that American companies were making choices about their own content, their own public statements, their own employees' speech, on the basis of what Beijing would find acceptable. The Banned in China episode named this dynamic explicitly, refused to participate in it, and accepted the consequences, being erased from an entire country's internet without apparent concern. Bloomberg News later reported that Apple, which has a significant manufacturing presence in China and a substantial Chinese user base, was unlikely to bid for South Park's streaming rights in part because of the China ban. The controversy was having real business implications. Parker and Stone's response to those implications was to continue criticizing China's censorship practices in subsequent episodes of Season 23. In the years following Banned in China, the broader conversation in America about how Western companies engage with authoritarian governments became much more prominent in mainstream public discourse. Politicians began asking questions about corporate complicity. Journalists who had been covering the issue for years found larger audiences for their work. The specific practices Parker and Stone had satirized, Hollywood studios editing films to pass Chinese censors, American tech companies removing apps at the Chinese government's request, sports organizations pressuring their employees not to speak freely on political topics began receiving the scrutiny they deserved. South Park did not cause this shift alone, but the episode was one of the most visible moments in a gradual awakening, and it arrived at a time when the argument it was making needed to be made loudly enough to cut through the noise. A construction paper cartoon about a marijuana farmer in a labor camp with Winnie the Pooh did more to bring corporate self-censorship into mainstream conversation than many years of earnest journalism. That is what comedy at its most powerful can do. Not just make you laugh, make you see something you had been trained not to notice. Section 11. The Book of Mormon, Team America, and A Life Beyond South Park. The conversation about the Book of Mormon musical began in its initial embryonic form sometime around 2003. Parker and Stone were working on Team America, World Police, their feature-length puppet satire of American foreign policy and action cinema, and they went to see a musical called Avenue Q on Broadway, which had been co-written by a songwriter named Robert Lopez. Lopez noticed them in the audience, introduced himself, and discovered that they were interested in the same things he was. Irreverence, precision, the structural possibilities of musical theater, as a vehicle for subject matter that musical theater had not traditionally attempted. The three of them began a conversation that would continue in scattered sessions between South Park seasons and other projects for the better part of a decade. Parker and Stone had been interested in Mormonism for years. It appeared in their film Orgasmo. It appeared in the South Park episode All About Mormons. It had a presence in their work that reflected their fascination with sincere belief and the sometimes absurd stories that sincere belief is built on. Lopez was interested in Joseph Smith and the founding mythology of the Latter-day Saint movement. They found they were interested in the same story. two young Mormon missionaries sent to Uganda, confronting a world that their faith had not prepared them for, and the question of what happens to belief when it encounters a reality that belief alone cannot address. The musical was worked on in fragments. A weekend here, 3 weeks in London there, sessions in New York whenever Parker and Stone could escape the South Park production schedule. They flew constantly between Los Angeles and New York. They wrote songs, rewrote songs, threw out songs, and wrote better ones. They went through workshops that felt provisional and unfinished for years before anything snapped into place. The Book of Mormon premiered on Broadway at the Eugene O'Neill Theater on March 23, 2011. The show had been in development, in one form or another, since 2003, 8 years of intermittent work alongside everything else Parker and Stone were doing. The result was, and remains, one of the most successful original musicals in Broadway history. It received 9 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. The cast recording became the highest-charting Broadway album in over 4 decades. The production expanded to a West End run in London, multiple national tours and productions around the world. The Mormon Church's response to the musical was instructive. They did not protest. They did not threaten legal action. They placed advertisements in the playbills of the show's Broadway run that read, "In effect, you've seen the show, now read the book." The gentleness of this response, which came from an institution that was the target of sustained, detailed, satirical analysis by 2 of the most effective satirists in America, was something Parker later described as genuinely impressive. He said the Mormon community's willingness to take the joke, to allow the laughter without becoming defensive or litigious, had increased his respect for the faith and its practitioners. Compare this response to Scientology's response to Trapped in the Closet, and the contrast tells you something significant about the difference between a religion that is secure in itself and one that is not. Team America, World Police, released in October of 2004, was an entirely different kind of project. The film uses marionette puppets filmed in miniature. Real physical puppets, real physical sets, everything built in meticulous scale, to tell a story about a global anti-terrorism organization, staffed by American operatives who cause as much destruction as they prevent. The film satirizes post-9/11 American foreign policy, action movie conventions, and Hollywood celebrities who engage in political activism, and it does all of this with complete sincerity about being a puppet film. The production was extremely difficult. Parker and Stone had no experience with puppet filmmaking, miniature sets, or the specific physical and logistical challenges of their chosen format. The puppets were expensive, difficult to operate, and prone to malfunctions. Scenes that should have taken a day took a week. Scenes that should have been simple became elaborate technical problems. Parker has said in interviews that the experience was one of the most challenging productions he has ever been involved in, and that the final film reflects both the creative commitment they brought to it and the exhaustion of the process. The film's approach to its subject matter follows the same principles as South Park at its most ambitious. It is simultaneously a satire of the thing it depicts and an affectionate tribute to it. Team America is a brilliant action film that mocks action films. It is a sincere exploration of American power and its consequences that presents both the appeal and the cost of that power with equal clarity. Parker and Stone's outside-the-show projects have consistently demonstrated something important. The South Park sensibility is not a television format, it is a worldview. It applies equally well to Broadway musicals, puppet action films, student films about cannibalism, and animated comedy. The vehicle changes. The underlying commitment to following the joke wherever it leads, to saying the true thing even when the true thing is uncomfortable, to treating the audience as people who can handle more than they are usually given credit for, that commitment stays constant. Section 12. The Middle Seasons. When South Park became something else entirely. If you want to understand South Park at the height of its creative powers, the window you are looking for runs roughly from Season 5 through Season 12, spanning approximately 2001 to 2008. These are the years when the show stopped being primarily about shock and became something more genuinely ambitious, when the writing became tighter and more architecturally precise, when the satire became more pointed and more willing to make arguments rather than simply mock. and when individual episodes began achieving the kind of quality that you would associate with prestige drama rather than cable comedy. Season 5, which aired in 2001, contains what many critics and fans consider the single greatest episode in the show's history. Scott Tenorman Must Die. It aired on July 11, 2001 as the fourth episode of the season, and it changed everything about what South Park was understood to be capable of. The setup is deceptively simple. Eric Cartman has been humiliated by an older kid named Scott Tenorman, who tricks him into buying his pubic hair for $10. Cartman, whose capacity for grudges is essentially infinite, dedicates himself to revenge. The episode follows his various attempts, each of which fails, each of which gets progressively more baroque and elaborate. And then the finale arrives, and the episode goes somewhere that even the show's most devoted fans did not see coming. Cartman arranges for Scott's parents to be shot by a farmer by manipulating events so that they trespass on his property during what he has falsely advertised as a local pony killing season. He arranges for their bodies to be ground up by the pony meat processing plant he has secretly established on the farmer's land. He arranges for the resulting processed meat to be incorporated into a batch of chili, which he serves to Scott at a chili cook-off he has organized specifically for this purpose. Scott Tenorman eats his own parents. Cartman appears, licks the tears from Scott's face, and tells him, "This is what happens to people who mess with him." The reaction from the audience when this episode aired was a kind of stunned laughter. Not the ordinary laughter of someone watching something funny, but the specific laughter of someone who has just seen something they cannot quite believe they watched. Parker and Stone had not just written a dark joke. They had written a character. Cartman before Scott Tenorman Must Die was a bully, a racist, a manipulative fat child who usually got his comeuppance. Cartman after Scott Tenorman Must Die was something else, a genuinely dangerous person living inside a cartoon, capable of patience and premeditation and a cold-bloodedness that was not played for shock but for genuine character revelation. Every Cartman episode after that one carries a weight that the earlier ones do not, because you know, somewhere in the back of your mind, what he is capable of. The episode demonstrates something that distinguishes South Park from most of its contemporaries. The writers are not afraid to permanently alter the nature of their own characters in ways that cannot be walked back. A lesser show would have treated Scott Tenorman Must Die as a standalone anomaly, a one-off departure from the normal Cartman. South Park treated it as revelation, and kept the character consistent with what had been revealed for the following 2 decades. Around the same period, the show produced several episodes that were almost entirely serious in their underlying intention, while remaining formally comedic. Best Friends Forever, which aired in March of 2005 and won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, was a direct and unambiguous commentary on the Terry Schiavo Right to Die case, which was dominating American news at the time. The episode presented all sides of the argument with genuine care and reached a conclusion that was both clear and earned. It was one of the most nakedly political episodes the show had attempted, and it was entirely successful, more persuasive than 100 op-eds, more emotionally affecting than most straight news coverage, and funnier than either. Imagination Land, a 3-part storyline from season 11, represented the show's most ambitious narrative experiment to that point. A fully realized alternate dimension populated by every fictional character from human mythology, where a terrorist attack threatens to destroy the human capacity for imagination itself. The episodes were baroque and operatic and filled with the kind of genuine feeling that the show's critics often claimed was absent. They won a separate Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program for programming 1 hour or more in length. 3 construction paper episodes about imagination defeating terrorism took home the Television Academy's highest honor for long-form animated programming. The show's relationship with religion during this middle era was particularly sophisticated. The All About Mormons episode from 2003 explored the founding mythology of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with a combination of genuine research and gleeful absurdism. The story of Joseph Smith, the golden plates, the hat with the seeing stones. All of it was presented accurately and then undercut with a repeated title card reading, "Dum dum 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 dum," whenever something seemed particularly implausible. And yet the episode ended with Gary, the Mormon child, delivering a speech that affirmed the genuine value of faith and community, even when the founding stories are difficult to believe, and then telling Stan to suck his balls when Stan responds with condescension. It was, and remains, one of the most honest and simultaneously most irreverent treatments of religious faith in American entertainment. This balance, the ability to mock something completely and simultaneously acknowledge its value, is rare. Most satire operates through demolition. It finds the weak point in an institution or a belief and pushes until the whole structure falls. South Park, at its best, does something harder. It finds the weak point and pushes hard and then steps back and shows you what was worth preserving in the rubble. The Season 9 episode Trapped in the Closet did this for Scientology. The Season 7 episode All About Mormons did this for Mormonism. The various episodes dealing with Christianity, the recurring presence of Jesus as a somewhat ineffectual local celebrity, beloved but unable to quite live up to the expectations placed on him, managed to be both theologically pointed and genuinely affectionate. The middle seasons were also the period in which the show's engagement with current events became most seamlessly integrated with its comedic structure. Parker and Stone had mastered the 6-day production schedule by this point and were using it with genuine virtuosity, finding angles on news stories that no other show could reach because no other show was working fast enough to respond before the moment had passed. The 2004 presidential election inspired the episode Douche and Turd, in which the student body of South Park Elementary is forced to choose between a giant douche and a turd sandwich as their school mascot. Stan's refusal to vote because both options are awful becomes the central conflict, and the episode's resolution that voting is important not because the options are good, but because participation in the system is itself meaningful, regardless of the quality of the available choices, is more substantive political philosophy than most actual political commentary manages. It was also, of course, a joke about two specific candidates in a specific election. The genius of the episode is that the joke and the argument are the same thing. You cannot separate the political analysis from the comedy because they are constructed as a single object. The seasons from 5 through 12 also contain the emotional core of the show's relationship with its characters. Kenny's death arc, which had been a running gag since the first episode, received its most consequential treatment in the season 5 episode Kenny Dies, in which Kenny contracts a terminal illness and the reality of his impending death is played entirely straight. The episode is genuinely moving. Stan cannot deal with the fact that his friend is dying, and the show does not soften this or use it as a setup for a joke. It sits with the grief and makes it real. Then Kenny dies, and in the following season he is simply gone. His absence from season 6 is noticeable and strange, like a missing tooth. His return at the season's end, emerging from his own house as though nothing had happened and nobody had noticed, says something about the show's relationship with death and continuity and memory that is funnier and more touching for all the earnestness that preceded it. Butters Stotch, the sweetly naive child who became one of the most beloved supporting characters in the show's history, grew into something like a moral counterweight to Cartman during this period. Where Cartman is the show's darkest impulse, its most ruthless satirical instrument, Butters is its most innocent and therefore most vulnerable one. The episodes exploring his home life, his parents' troubled marriage, and his constant confused attempts to understand the world around him have a gentleness that cuts against the prevailing tone without ever feeling out of place. He is wrong about almost everything and right about almost nothing, and watching him navigate a world that is more complicated and more cynical than he can comprehend is one of the show's most reliable sources of both comedy and something that isn't far from heartbreak. The Columbine connection deserves its own moment of reflection during this section. On April 20th, 1999, Columbine High School, in the Littleton, Colorado school district where Matt Stone grew up, where he attended Heritage High School, was the site of a mass shooting carried out by 2 students. 12 students and 1 teacher were killed. 21 others were injured. The event was and remains one of the most traumatic episodes in American educational history. And it landed differently for Parker and Stone than for most people in the entertainment industry because it happened where they were from. South Park had been on the air for less than 2 years when the shooting occurred. The show had already been the subject of sustained criticism for being the kind of content that might corrupt young people or contribute to the culture of violence. Those criticisms, which had felt relatively abstract before April 1999, became something more charged in the aftermath. Parker and Stone were two Colorado boys whose show was being blamed, in some cultural corners, for exactly the kind of cultural environment that might produce exactly the kind of events that had just happened in their home state. They never publicly addressed this tension directly, but the shadow of Columbine runs through the show's middle era in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely but impossible to entirely ignore. The show's recurring willingness to treat death as meaningful rather than trivial, its genuine emotional engagement with questions of violence and consequence, its insistence on finding the real feeling underneath the comedy, these qualities were sharpened, I think, by proximity to something that was genuinely not funny, and that Parker and Stone could not reduce to a joke because they had grown up in its geography. Section 13. The Serialization Experiment and the Trump Era. In 2015, South Park did something that surprised everyone who thought they understood how the show worked. It went serial. For the first 18 years of its existence, South Park had operated almost exclusively as an anthology. Each episode was self-contained, beginning fresh and ending with whatever conclusion or lack of conclusion Parker and Stone felt was appropriate, with no particular obligation to continuity or ongoing storylines. Characters might change slowly over time, but the week-to-week experience was one of discrete, independent units. You could drop into any episode of South Park with no prior knowledge, and within the first few minutes, understand everything you needed to understand. Seasons 19 and 20 abandoned this. Season 19, which aired in the fall of 2015, introduced PC Principal, a new school administrator whose obsessive commitment to political correctness initially seemed like another target for mockery but gradually revealed itself as a more complex character with a more nuanced relationship to the ideas he represented. The season built to a climax involving gentrification, corporate media manipulation, and the town of South Park being fundamentally transformed by forces it could not control. It was, by South Park's standards, ambitious storytelling. Season 20, which aired in the fall of 2016, attempted something even more ambitious: a season-long storyline about online trolling, internet culture, and the 2016 presidential election. Parker and Stone constructed an elaborate narrative that assumed, based on all available evidence in September of 2016, that Hillary Clinton would win the election. The Mr. Garrison character, who had been functioning as a Trump stand-in throughout the season, was positioned to lose and face consequences. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump won. The episode that was scheduled to air the following night had been written entirely around a different outcome. Parker and Stone pulled an all-nighter, rewrote the episode from scratch, and delivered something to Comedy Central that was, by their own later admission, not their best work. The episode was called OGs, and it showed. The rewrite was hasty, the storylines were incomplete, the emotional landing was unclear. Parker has been honest in interviews about this. He acknowledges that the serialization experiment was a mistake, that the 6-day production format is built for responsive standalone work, not for long-form narrative planning, and that the 2016 election exposed this vulnerability in the clearest possible way. Starting with season 21, the show returned to a predominantly episodic format. Some continuity was maintained, certain character relationships and situations carried over from week to week. But the rigid serialization was abandoned. Parker described it as going back to what the show actually is, which is a show that wakes up every week and says what is happening right now and what do we have to say about it. The Trump era posed a specific creative problem for South Park that went beyond the serialization question. Throughout his first presidential campaign and first term, Trump was such an outsized presence in American cultural life that writing about anything else felt like avoidance, but writing about Trump specifically felt like an exhausting obligation that was pulling the show away from the range of subjects it had always covered. Parker and Stone tried various approaches. The Mr. Garrison stand-in, episodes that addressed the political climate obliquely through other storylines, a season premiere that addressed white supremacy and the aftermath of Charlottesville with unusual directness. None of it fully satisfied either the show's creators or its audience. and Parker's later comments about Trump exhaustion had the ring of genuine creative frustration rather than strategic positioning. The show also had to navigate its own political identity during this period. For most of its history, South Park had been understood as equal opportunity in its mockery. Conservative and liberal alike were targets. Nobody was spared. The show's consistent position was that anyone who took their own beliefs too seriously was worthy of ridicule. This positioning had given the show a cross-ideological audience and a reputation for balance that allowed it to say things about sensitive subjects that a more obviously partisan show could not. But as American politics polarized, the equal opportunity framing became harder to maintain without consequences. When you mock both sides in a political environment where the sides are not equivalent, where one side is operating within the democratic norms of political behavior and one side is openly challenging those norms, treating them with equal irreverence is itself a political choice. It is not a neutral position. It is the position of someone who would rather be funny than be accurate, and South Park had always, at its best, been both. Parker addressed this in a New York Times interview during the later Trump years in a way that suggested genuine self-reflection. He talked about how he and Stone had entered the Trump era believing that political correctness was the primary threat to comedy and free expression, and how watching the Trump movement operate had complicated that belief. Political correctness could be annoying and restricting, but it was operating within a shared reality. It was making arguments about what words mean and what representations do, which are real arguments that can be engaged and debated. The specific quality of the Trump movement that Parker found more threatening was its relationship to truth itself. The willingness to simply assert that things that happened did not happen, that things that are true are not true, that the shared factual basis for argument and satire does not exist. Satire depends on a shared reality. You can only mock something if the audience agrees that the thing being mocked exists in the way you say it does. When that agreement is withdrawn, satire is left pointing at nothing. This is what Parker meant when he said politics had become pop culture. He did not mean that politics was entertaining, though it certainly was. He meant that politics had become subject to the same mechanisms of celebrity and narrative and reality distortion that entertainment had always been subject to, that the same forces that made reality television compelling, the constructed drama, the personality cults, the editing that transforms real events into stories, had migrated into governance itself. And a show that had always found its material at the intersection of entertainment and reality found, in the Trump era, that the intersection had become the whole map. The pandemic years added another layer of complexity. When COVID-19 arrived in 2020 and effectively shut down the world, South Park responded with a series of extended specials for Paramount Plus rather than regular episodes. The pandemic special, which aired on September 30th, 2020, drew approximately 3.2 million viewers, remarkable for cable in an era of declining linear viewership. It depicted Randy Marsh as having inadvertently caused the pandemic through a sexual encounter with a pangolin in China, addressed police brutality, remote learning, and the beginnings of vaccine politics. It was received with a combination of appreciation for its speed and accuracy and criticism for the Randy Pangolin storyline, which some felt was irresponsible in its treatment of a real public health crisis's origins, even as the joke was clearly targeting conspiracy theories rather than endorsing them. The Paramount Plus specials format, extended episodes behind a streaming paywall rather than standard 22-minute episodes on cable, was itself controversial within the fan community. Some longtime viewers felt the move signaled a shift in the show's identity, from a cable show that was part of the common culture to a streaming product that required a subscription to access. The financial logic was obvious. The Paramount Plus deal was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the specials were designed to drive subscriptions to the platform. But something about the arrangement sat uneasily with the show's self-image as the show that talks about what's happening right now, openly, for everyone who wants to watch. The tension between the show's anti-corporate identity and its very corporate business arrangements has been a running thread through its later years, and Parker and Stone have addressed it with characteristic self-awareness through the Randy Marsh Tegrity Farms storyline. a multi-season arc in which Randy operates a marijuana farm that he insists represents integrity and honest values, while making increasingly mercenary business decisions, claiming integrity while practicing compromise. It is impossible to watch this arc without understanding that Parker and Stone are satirizing themselves, and that the satire is genuine. They know what they are. They know the deals they have made. They would rather make fun of themselves for those deals than pretend they haven't made them. Section 14. Season 27. Satan's Boyfriend and a White House Condemnation. South Park returned in July of 2025 after a hiatus of over 2 years. The show had gone quiet after the season 26 finale in March of 2023, and the reasons for the delay were multiple and intersecting. The complicated corporate situation at Paramount, which was in the middle of a protracted merger with Skydance Media and negotiations that had become contentious enough that Parker and Stone had publicly expressed frustration with the process. Parker and Stone's own stated desire to not address Donald Trump again, having found the subject exhausting and creatively limiting during the years they had dealt with it through the character of Mr. Garrison, and a general sense that they wanted to wait until they had something genuinely worth saying. In the months leading up to the return, Parker told Vanity Fair that he genuinely didn't know what else could be said about Trump, that the topic had taken over everything during the previous years and made the show less fun, and that they were trying to find a way back to the energy that had made it great. 9 months later, they made an entire season about Trump. On July 23, 2025, just hours after Parker and Stone signed a new 5-year deal with Paramount reportedly valued at $1.5 billion for 50 new episodes, the season 27 premiere aired on Comedy Central. It was the first traditional episode in more than 2 years. It was called Sermon on the Mount. The episode was, by any measure, one of the most audacious things the show had ever done. Trump appears as a character for the first time in the show's history. Parker and Stone had previously used Mr. Garrison as a stand-in, but this time they went directly. Trump is depicted as inhabiting the White House surrounded by portraits that mock his military self-image. He is shown in a sexual relationship with Satan, a callback to the show's 1999 film, in which Saddam Hussein occupied the same role. He has a micro-penis, which is depicted multiple times, including in a live-action sequence at the end of the episode using deepfake technology developed by Parker and Stone's production company. He threatens to sue anyone who disagrees with him. He is, in the episode's logic, the most powerful and most fragile person simultaneously, capable of destroying institutions and desperately sensitive to any slight. Jesus appears at South Park Elementary as part of the Trump administration's push for more Christianity in public schools. But when the townspeople prepare to fight back against this, Jesus pulls them aside and whispers the reason he is there. It is part of a lawsuit settlement. Paramount made a deal with Trump to avoid litigation. Jesus is contractually obligated to be there. He references the cancellation of Stephen Colbert's Late Show, which had just been announced by Paramount's CBS network in what many observers saw as a capitulation to pressure from the Trump administration, and urges the townspeople not to provoke a similar fate for South Park. The episode was biting its own corporate parent on the same day that corporate parent was writing it the largest check in the show's history. Parker and Stone were making fun of the deal they had just signed, using Jesus Christ as the vehicle, while simultaneously banking the proceeds of that deal. The self-awareness of the move was total. Within 24 hours, the White House issued an official statement. White House spokesperson Taylor Rogers said the show had been irrelevant for over 20 years, that it was barely surviving with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention, and that it was fourth-rate. The statement also said the left had no authentic or original content, and cited what the spokesperson characterized as hypocrisy among those now praising the show after years of criticizing it. The White House, the most powerful office in the world, the center of the executive branch of the United States government, took time out of its day to issue an official condemnation of a cartoon made of construction paper. Parker's response at San Diego Comic-Con the following day was delivered to a room full of people who had been waiting for it. He looked at the camera. He paused. He said with complete deadpan sincerity, "We're terribly sorry." He stared for approximately 5 seconds. The room exploded with laughter. The response was identical in structure and tone to the mock apology Parker and Stone had issued to China in 2019. It was the same move they had been running since 1997. When someone powerful tells you to stop, you don't stop, and you make your refusal to stop as funny as possible. You reduce the power of the demand by treating it as beneath serious engagement, and you do it with such precision and such obvious pleasure that the demand ends up making you look better than you would have if no one had made it. Season 27 went on to cover more ground. J.D. Vance was depicted as Trump's minion, a characterization Vance himself responded to on social media with apparent good humor, saying he had finally made it. Kristi Noem was depicted in a reference to her admitted killing of her family dog, described in her own autobiography. Season 28 continued the storyline, depicting Trump in a relationship with Satan, where Trump was increasingly the aggressor, a reversal of the dynamic from the 1999 film, where Saddam Hussein had been Satan's abusive boyfriend. Parker told the New York Times during this period something that serves as an unusually clear statement of what the show had become. Politics became pop culture. What he meant was that the separation between entertainment and political reality had effectively dissolved, that the same cultural forces that drove celebrity gossip and internet trends were now driving the presidency and the legislative calendar and the international relationships that determined the shape of the world. And a show that had always drawn its material from the intersection of entertainment and reality could not avoid politics because there was no longer a meaningful distinction. The viewership numbers for season 27 were the highest Comedy Central had seen since 2018. The show that the White House had called irrelevant and barely surviving averaged 6.2 million global multi-platform viewers for its second episode in the first 3 days after broadcast. For a cable television show in 2025, when linear television viewership had been declining for over a decade and streaming fragmentation had made those kinds of numbers increasingly rare, that was genuinely remarkable. The 5-year, 50-episode deal with Paramount means that South Park will continue at least through 2030. Parker and Stone will be in their early 60s when that deal concludes. The show they started making in a film classroom in Colorado when they were in their early 20s with no money and no prospects will be somewhere past his 30th birthday. What does that mean? What does it mean that this show, which started as a Christmas card made from paper and glue and an old camera, which was made viral before viral was a concept, which was condemned by parent councils and religious organizations and foreign governments, and eventually the White House of the United States of America, is still here? Still making people laugh, still making people furious, still generating arguments in comment sections and think pieces in official government communications? It means, I think, that what Parker and Stone found in that Colorado classroom was genuinely rare. Not just the talent, though the talent is obvious. Not just the work ethic, though 28 seasons produced mostly on a 6-day timeline is a staggering output of creative labor. Something rarer than either of those things. They found a way to be honest on television. Not nice, not careful, not calibrated for approval. Honest. Honest about the things that were funny and the things that were frightening and the things that were both at once. Honest about the absurdity of the world and the people who live in it, including themselves. Honest in a way that costs something, that requires periodically standing up to lawyers and network executives and foreign governments and the occupants of the White House and saying, plainly, that the joke is going in the episode. There is an elegance to the arc of it. 2 students with construction paper and scissors making a 3-minute film for a class screening. A Christmas card that escaped into the early internet and spread without permission, person by person, copied and recopied, watched on slow dial-up connections by people who couldn't stop showing it to their friends. A network that said yes when every test audience said no. A show that became the most watched thing on basic cable while everyone was trying to have it canceled. A movie that was submitted to the ratings board 6 times and still got made. A Broadway musical that took 8 years to complete and won 9 Tony Awards. A Banned in China episode that got a show erased from the largest internet in the world and responded by taunting the government that had done the erasing. And a season 27 premiere that drew a White House condemnation within 24 hours and a deadpan 2-word response from its creator. We're terribly sorry. They're not sorry. They have never been sorry. And somehow, that refusal to be sorry, that's an yeah, that persistent, cheerful, completely sincere commitment to following the joke wherever it leads and saying the true thing, regardless of who finds it inconvenient, has produced something that has lasted nearly 30 years and shows no signs of stopping. 4 children in a small Colorado town. Construction paper and computer software and an old 8mm camera somewhere at the beginning of all of it. 2 guys from Colorado who started out making each other laugh and never really stopped. There is something beautiful about that. Crude and profane and occasionally wrong and occasionally brilliant and consistently, stubbornly, irreducibly itself. That's the entire story of South Park. Or at least the story as it stands tonight. There's more being made right now, somewhere in a studio in Los Angeles, probably on a 6-day deadline. Probably with someone pacing the writer's room at 2 in the morning, trying to find the angle, the thing nobody else has said, the joke that is also the truth. We'll see it on Wednesday. Section 15. What it all means. Legacy, longevity, and the show that refused to end. I want to slow down here in the quiet end of this long story and think about what South Park actually is. Not what it does, or what it says, or what controversies it generates, but what it is, as a thing that has existed in the world for nearly 30 years and shows no sign of being finished. It is, first and most obviously, a business, a remarkably successful one. The 2021 deal with Viacom-CBS was worth $900 million. The 2025 deal with Paramount was worth $1.5 billion for 50 new episodes and streaming rights. When you add the theatrical film, the merchandise, the licensing, the syndication, the international distribution, the streaming revenue, South Park is one of the most valuable media properties in the world. 2 people who met in a film class in 1992 and made a student short for a semester screening have built, over 3 decades, one of the most commercially significant entertainment franchises in American television history. The financial arc of it is staggering, and it is built entirely on content that no one in mainstream media would have predicted could be commercially viable at the scale it has achieved. It is also a creative achievement of a very specific and unusual kind. Most long-running television shows decline. The Simpsons, which is the only animated American sitcom that has been on the air longer than South Park, is widely understood to be a pale shadow of its early seasons. Family Guy has followed a similar trajectory. The general pattern for shows that run long enough is that the initial creative energy dissipates as the original team burns out, or moves on, or loses the hunger that drove the early work. The show finds formulas that work and relies on them. The edges soften. The surprises become predictable. South Park has not followed this pattern in the same way, and I think the reason is structural. The 6-day production schedule forces the show to confront the blank page anew every single week. There is no coasting on established formulas because the formula doesn't survive contact with whatever is actually happening in the world this specific week. You have to find a new angle every time because the news doesn't repeat itself, and neither can you. The constraint that seems like it would produce worse work has instead kept the show vital in a way that more comfortable production arrangements have not. Parker has said in interviews that when he starts each episode with nothing, a blank page, a world full of things happening, and 6 days to say something about it, he is forced into a kind of creative state that he would not reach if he had more time. The urgency strips away the second-guessing, the self-censorship, the tendency to revise away the dangerous thing and replace it with the safe thing. You do not have time to be afraid of your own ideas when you have to put them on television by Wednesday. The show has also had the good fortune of remaining in the hands of its creators. Parker and Stone have maintained creative control over South Park in a way that is genuinely rare in American television. Most successful shows are eventually subject to network interference, creative compromises imposed by business concerns, personnel changes that dilute the original vision. South Park has had its conflicts with Comedy Central. The Muhammad censorship episodes are the most dramatic example, but Parker and Stone have never lost the fundamental ability to make the show they want to make. The network has always blinked first. The creators have always gotten their way on the things that mattered to them. This combination, financial success, creative control, structural conditions that prevent complacency, has allowed South Park to do something that almost no other long-running show has managed. to remain genuinely surprising. Not always. There are episodes that feel like the show going through motions, seasons that feel thinner than others, but the possibility of surprise has never left. The episode that will change everything, the joke that will land in a way nobody anticipated, the moment where comedy and truth collide with a precision that leaves you slightly stunned, that possibility is still present in every new episode, and it keeps the audience coming back. The show has also left a legacy in the culture that extends well beyond its own episodes. South Park premiered in 1997. Family Guy premiered in 1999. Adult Swim launched in 2001. The space for adult animation on American television that South Park helped create has produced some of the most interesting and important television comedy of the past 3 decades. Chappelle's Show, Moral Orel, Archer, Rick and Morty. These shows exist in a landscape that South Park helped shape, not through direct imitation but through the proof of concept it provided. You could make challenging, transgressive, genuinely funny animated comedy for adults and find an enormous audience for it. South Park demonstrated that, and the demonstration mattered. Beyond animation, the show has contributed to the broader culture of American comedy in ways that are harder to trace but no less real. The willingness to follow a premise to its most uncomfortable conclusion, to say the true thing even when the true thing makes people angry, to treat the audience as people capable of handling complexity and discomfort. These are not uniquely South Park qualities, but South Park has embodied them more consistently and more visibly than almost any other mainstream entertainment property. And the visibility matters. When the most successful show on cable television operates according to a particular set of principles for 3 decades, those principles become more conceivable as options. They become part of what is understood to be possible. The show's failures are real too, and I don't want to smooth them over. The Man Bear Pig episode, which aired in 2006 and mocked concern about climate change as paranoid and silly, was wrong. Not just edgy, not just provocative, but factually incorrect about something consequential. Parker and Stone corrected this in 2018, making Man Bear Pig real and having the boys apologize to Al Gore for not listening, which was a genuine moment of accountability that few shows have managed and which deserves credit. But there were 12 years between the mockery and the correction, during which millions of people absorbed the message that climate concern was foolishness. The correction doesn't erase that. Some of the show's treatment of race, particularly in the accumulated weight of jokes about racial stereotypes over nearly 30 seasons, has aged badly or simply was bad to begin with. The show's insistence on equal opportunity offensiveness has sometimes served as a cover for jokes that are not equally weighted, that land differently when directed at a group with social power versus a group without it, and that pretending otherwise is its own form of dishonesty. The show would argue that it treats everyone the same. The argument is not entirely convincing, and it never quite has been. The sexual assault imagery used in the 2008 China Problem episode, in which Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are depicted sexually assaulting Indiana Jones as a metaphor for the disappointing Crystal Skull film, was, by most honest assessments, a misstep. The underlying feeling it was trying to express was real. The specific grief of watching something you loved be treated carelessly by the people who were supposed to protect it. But the imagery used to express that feeling was harmful in a way that the comedic framing did not neutralize, and the episode has not aged well. These failures matter. They are part of the complete picture of what South Park is, and anyone who claims the show is beyond criticism is not engaging honestly with the full record. But so are the successes. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which treated a gay character with warmth and dignity in 1997, when most of television was either ignoring gay people or treating them as objects of ridicule. Best Friends Forever, which made a genuine moral argument about death and dignity and the right to die in 2005. The Man Bear Pig correction in 2018. Scott Tenorman must die. Imagination Land, the Band in China episode and everything that followed from it. The show has been around long enough to have made a difference in real ways, to have changed minds and conversations on subjects that matter. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, fairly rare. There is a quality to South Park at its best that I find genuinely difficult to describe without resorting to words like honesty, which feels insufficient. It is something about the relationship between the crudeness and the intelligence. The way the crude exterior is not a disguise for the intelligence, but a genuine part of it, a delivery mechanism that allows the intelligence to reach places it could not reach in more refined packaging. The paper cutout aesthetic, the children's cartoon framing, the fart jokes, and the profanity. They are not what the show is despite, they are part of what it is. Take them away and you do not have a more intelligent South Park. You have something else entirely. Something smaller and less capable of the specific things that South Park does best. The show understands this about itself. That is why Parker has talked about how the crude animation is not a limitation, but a liberation. How the fact that it looks like it was made by a 5-year-old is part of why you can say things in it that you could not say in something that looked like it cost more. The medium is always part of the message, and South Park's medium has always been part of its message. What Parker and Stone built in that Colorado classroom, with scissors and paper and an 8mm camera, was a machine for saying things that needed to be said in ways that people would actually hear. Not every week, not every episode, but often enough and with enough precision to matter. The machine is still running. The show is still being made, still following the same 6-day deadline, still finding angles that no other show is reaching because no other show is moving fast enough and caring deeply enough simultaneously, still surprising people who thought they had figured it out. That is the story of South Park. Not a clean story, not a story without failures and compromises and moments of genuine harm alongside the genuine brilliance. But a story worth telling, worth knowing, worth carrying with you as you drift towards sleep. 4 children in a small Colorado town. A Christmas card made of paper. 2 guys from Colorado who started making each other laugh and never stopped. Good night.